It's Wednesday, January 6th. Welcome to our special edition of the TAP and Environmental Committee. We're going to move right into some topics on Charlotte Moves that we're going to have to take action on today to move to full council. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jayoba to kick us off. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I didn't have introductions of the committee. I'm Julie Eisel, committee chair, and if we could have introductions from anybody online from the committee.
Braxton Winston, vice chair.
Larkin Eggleston, vice chair.
Good morning, Matt Newton, committee member.
Okay, and we don't
Wrong committee, wrong time.
How about staff? Who is on today? Can you introduce yourselves?
Good morning. This is Taiwo Jayoba, Planning Director and Assistant City Manager. Good morning.
Good morning. This is
Happy
Liz
New Year.
Babson. Good morning. This is Liz Babson, Director for the Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Kelly Flannery, CFO.
And good morning, Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Okay, that looks like it's it. So let's go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Jayoba. Get us started.
Thank you very much, Mayor Pro Tem. Good morning once again and Happy New Year to everyone. I just have a couple of slides to share with you, but they're more like reminder slides than anything else. The first slide, or the second slide you've seen before, I don't know if we can pull that presentation up. Yes, quickly. Let's go to the second slide. You've seen this before, and this is really just reminding us and our audience of the recommendations that were in the task force, Charlotte Moves Task Force final report, which was submitted to council and presented on December 14. Essentially threefold recommendations. One is to asking the City Council to invest in mobility to meet Charlotte's changing needs, to align mobility investment with related initiatives that we have in the city or that we are aspiring to, and then to commit the resources to achieve the vision. So the next slide is really your action for today, and that is the last slide, that in accordance with the direction we received, that this goes through TAP to full council for report out. The action we're requesting is to direct the city manager to proceed with a strategy for legislative process formally so that we can begin to engage in formal dialogue with the assembly and anyone else, locally, regionally, the delegation, everyone that we've been working with for a little while now, but to pretty much have the city manager to continue formally on that legislative process. And the second action is to ask the city manager to refine the funding strategy that the Charlotte Moves Task Force has defined. If you recall, the Charlotte Moves Task Force defined a funding strategy that essentially says that while the program itself will cost $8 to $12 billion funded over a 30-year period, the local portion that will be submitted to the public for local referendum is 50% of that, which is $4 to $6 billion financed over the same time frame. And that is to be paid for with a potential increase in sales tax by 1 cent. The task force refers to that as 1 cent, 1 cent for mobility. And I just make a couple of comments on this one here with regards to refinement of the funding strategy. We do know that getting public support and even getting the support of the towns and the county and yourselves, we want to be as project specific as possible, as much as possible in a future referendum, as well as in our messaging. But that would take time. Hence the reason we're asking committee to recommend to council to direct the manager to refine that funding strategy. It will take time to pull all these projects together. So to that effect, over the next several weeks, we, that is the city, will be reaching out to, we'll be coordinating with our county, town partners in developing what we call a combined transportation projects list. We know that this list currently exists, and we know that those numbers are they do exist, as well as part of the Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization's Metropolitan Transportation Planning process. So we do not have to start from scratch. Most of those obviously will be the non-transit elements, such as roadway improvements, such as pedestrian improvements, as well as bikeways improvements. So we do know that they exist, and so we're not starting from scratch. But with the direction to the manager to refine that funding strategy, it allows us to coordinate with towns of Mint Hill, Pineville, Matthews, Cornelius, Huntersville, Davidson, and ourselves, of course, and the county, and pull all of these project lists together as part of that funding strategy refinement. So once the manager has the direction to go ahead and proceed with that, that will allow us to be able to start pulling all of this together. And then, like we said earlier, I think previously, we plan to come back to council in April with a refined funding strategy for consideration for adoption. We do know that everyone is curious about what the projects look like, but right now we're going to be working on a programmatic basis as we go forward with this, and while we continue to coordinate with the towns and the MTC, the Metropolitan Transit Commission as well. So those are the only, that's the only action, two-step action for the manager to begin to do, and that's what we're asking that you recommend to full council today. Thank you, and I'll stop there unless there are questions. If there's any other thing that you would like to know. Thank you.
Does the committee have any questions? I see Mr. Winston. Go ahead, Mr. Winston.
Yes, thank you, Ty, for that explanation. I think these recommendations are pretty straightforward, at least to us. I would like to point out that these recommendations are internal, but I would ask the committee to consider adding an additional recommendation to full council that really speaks to having an external conversation about this step. I think we should council members should work with a constituent services to hold information sessions, town halls, forums, whatever you want to call it, to explain this particular step. And perhaps maybe even have us as electeds reach out to some other elected officials throughout the county so we can have kind of an intimate understanding of what is going on. This step, I think we all understand it, but everybody, the community is going to want to have all of the conversations at once in this step. So it's going to be important for us to kind of manage that public conversation. And I think staff and council should adopt a kind of strategy or a way to explain each step as we're making these recommendations throughout the year. And I think it starts with right here. And does that make sense to staff or council?
I'll let everybody else weigh in. I mean, this particular step is what we direct the city manager to do. So
I understand that. I understand that. What I'm saying is that there needs to be a third step to direct staff and council to have a public outreach about this part of the process that we're directing the city manager to do.
Okay. Mr. Eggleston.
Thank you. Thanks, Ty. Well, this is a bit of an aside, but it seems as good a time as any, and it's not a new thought and one that I know you're well aware of, but I think as we start talking about a legislative process and a strategy to pursue these recommendations, I'm concerned about making sure that we've got, and I know we all are, but I'm concerned with making sure that we've got both our neighbors in Mecklenburg County and our neighbors adjacent to Mecklenburg County as best possible, standing with us in our efforts to move this forward. And I think we've seen in conversations I've had of late, and I'm sure others have as well, in addition to coverage in the media, we've seen some skepticism that I think is not surprising from North Mecklenburg in terms of feeling like there is a pie in the sky idea for them that has not yet really gotten much traction, and they're skeptical of whether it will going forward. So I think we're going to have to do extra work if we expect to have the support from people beyond Charlotte in the county and beyond Mecklenburg in the region. And without that support regionally, I think that we are dead in the water. So if you want to address that now in terms of the efforts that have been made towards that end, that's fine. Or if you prefer to circle back with a follow-up on that, that's fine as well.
I can respond to that briefly, and I can also follow up. Yes, we have been hearing that as well, but I'll say that while the task force was working on this, concurrently, we were also meeting with the House delegation for Mecklenburg County. We've met with the mayors of the different towns. We recently met with all the mayors, including the mayor of Mint Hill. We had not met with Mint Hill prior. But since the task force has made a recommendation for a county-wide sales tax for mobility, which was not the initial thought when the process was going on, we know that that work begins in earnest now because this is county-wide. Therefore, we're going to continue to build on the conversations we've been having with all the towns, with the county, because this is a county-wide effort. But not only that, we've also met with Union County. We're meeting with Cabarrus this week as well, and we're going to continue those meetings as well. While we know that this mobility plan is just Mecklenburg County-wide, we cannot just do this without connecting the dots with the adjoining counties. And you will notice during the public comment process on Monday that one of the commenters was Geraldine Gardner, the executive director for the regional council, Centralina, and she was on the task force for that very reason, because of the work that this regional council is doing on Connect Beyond. And that has been a very important and valuable effort, even as we continue this. So with the submission officially of the task force recommendations to council on December 14th, and with this direction to council, it allows us to continue to build on those conversations we've been having in earnest, and we'll come back to you in time as well to be reporting the progress we're making. We're going to definitely make sure that we're addressing a lot of the concerns that people have with regards to the project, with regards to the sales tax and how those connect, that this is not just about Charlotte. Even though it started as Charlotte Moves, we've had that should be rebranded to be more county-wide than just Charlotte. And so we are already working on that, and we'll be coming back to continue to give you an update on that. So good comment and good observation. Thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Newton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the brief presentation. Ty, I wanted to touch on concerns pertaining to the funding mechanism first, touch on those concerns. And I thought it was interesting in the Charlotte Moves recommendations, and I think that this is worth noting. Those concerns more specifically pertain to the funding mechanism unduly impacting marginalized communities. But what was really interesting to me was we were talking about, so Charlotte Moves was talking about exceptions to that as well. And I think that that bears noting an exception to groceries and medication. And I want to make sure that that's also incorporated in the considerations moving forward as this goes to the city manager's desk. At the same time, I wanted to ask about the strategic mobility plan that was mentioned Monday night. and wanted to ask. So it's my understanding that moving forward, the funding that we're considering here would apply to that strategic mobility plan. So I just wanted to ask if that is correct, and assuming it is correct, I wanted to ask what the process is for finalizing that strategic mobility plan moving forward, and the public or community input within it as well. If you could comment on those, please.
Oh, good questions, Councilmember Newton. Thank you very much. So the first one, yes. The answer to that is yes. Right now, the current sales tax does give exception to groceries and medication, and that will continue. But in addition to that, is we're also exploring some type of fares reduction for transit fare reduction. As part of this, we're going to be looking at that as part of the funding strategy refinement. So it's not just about groceries and medication, but also what can we do for the community when it comes to transit fares. With regards to the second piece on the strategy mobility plan, the short answer is yes. As the plan goes forward, there are two steps. So we come back to you with a refined funding strategy between now and April. Initially, we were looking at the strategy mobility plan itself coming to council in April as part of a comprehensive plan, but we pushed that out into June, May, June, when council is considering the FY22 budget as well as the CIP, because that's how it makes sense. So we want to make sure that you are able to look at everything within context. And a lot of the strategy mobility plan will have policies in there as well as the projects that will be carried forward. If you remember, the city right now has an adopted transportation action plan, which has a list of transportation projects in there. Those will be carried into the strategy mobility plan. But because they have bearing on the CIP budget, it's important to package all of this together when the city manager is discussing budget with you. So this strategy mobility plan will be part of the budget process that will be coming forward to you in early summer for adoption. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Driggs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ty, you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to recite the concerns that I've expressed in the past again. I just wanted to ask you, why is this vote necessary? I don't see why the manager and the staff cannot refine the plan and do these other things without the vote. And I'll tell you why that concerns me. The vote here is being offered as a kind of innocuous, just authorize us to do some more work. And I think, however, it will be interpreted as an endorsement, a go-ahead by this committee and by council. And I'm not yet in a position to be able to do that. You talk about refining the financing plan. As I understand it, the financing plan right now consists of assuming that we can get other people to pay for half of the cost of this plan, and that we are going to be able to pay for the rest of it with a 1-cent sales tax. That's not a financing plan. That doesn't really give us much to go on in terms of interpreting the consequences of making this commitment, what our capacity is for other capital needs, and so on. So I think if you look at the kind of feasibility that's done in conjunction with federal projects and the financing plan that is required to be submitted in applications, you'll find that there is a lot more in a financing plan. We are not at the point of merely needing to refine the concept that we have for financing here. So I just don't know enough to participate in a vote, as I say, that will be seen as an endorsement of the whole thing and not merely as authorization. I feel the manager should be able to proceed and get answers to some of these questions before council is asked to take a position. And I'm concerned that the popular perception of this is going to be that we are moving ahead with a significant tax increase and a huge fundraising project right in the midst of a worsening COVID situation, when the hardship in the community is such that the idea of a tax increase just doesn't sit well. I do feel it's a little tone deaf that way, but this timing. And it seems to me we ought to be able to do more work on this and get further in terms of having answers to many of these important questions without a council vote that appears to be a kind of signal that we are okay and that we want to move ahead. I don't see how council can make that determination now. So can you explain that a little further? Why do you need a vote right now?
So this is, thank you very much for your question, Councilman Badrick. So first of all, I clarify, this is not a financing plan. The task force was not charged with developing one, hence the reason we refer to it as a financing strategy, which is essentially you can have a couple scenarios. Should we go with property tax, or should we go with sales tax, or a combination of both, or maybe look at motor vehicle licensing fees or any other fees. So those are really just strategies. Now, that's really that was their task. And now that they've defined the strategy that, listen, we want this to be sales tax, the potential increase by 1 cent, this goes to council. Council now, under the direction to the city manager, is to go the next step. Because financing plan for each one of these will be different. Financing plan, like you rightly pointed out, for a rail transit project with the Federal Transit Administration will be different than a financing plan or a funding plan for a non-transit project. So they will definitely be different. So what we are refining right now is to be able to look at, can we really do this even with, you know, a full 1 cent or maybe 0.75 or 0.5, or within the context of other things that the city the other city initiatives or programs. The task force did not have the benefit of knowing those things, but the city manager does. And so it's very important that as you give him the direction, it's not necessarily voting to support the recommendations of the task force, but rather to direct the manager to begin the process for at least formalizing coordination and reaching out through the legislative process to see what can really happen between us and the North Carolina General Assembly to see what those funding mechanisms really look like within the context of all the projects that the city has. And then for the city manager to go right ahead and start coordinating with other towns in the county as well as the city without the direction from the council, almost like it's tacitly saying that council is doing this. Hence the reason why the formal request from council to the city manager to begin this process is important. Yes, we've already started reaching out to partners at the state level and regionally as well. But this recommendation to city council by TAP makes the process formal that allows us to be able to come back to you in April with a refined funding path as to how do you do this and do the other things that you have in the city. So that's essentially why. And with regards to the timing, right, we've had that and we've talked about that as well. But one thing that I just like to quickly point out is that if you will recall, and I don't know how many of us will, but the current half a cent that we have right now for transit, I believe that decision was made in 1998, but the collection of it did not really start until about 2 years or so later. So making a decision for a referendum in 2021 in this current situation that we have does not mean that the sales tax revenues kick off right away. It could very well be a year or so later for that to happen. But once you have a referendum in hand, it does allow you to be able to step forward and say to the federal government that you do have some form of shovel ready or some form of local match for a potential opportunity in the future. If you don't have it, and other communities like Austin and San Antonio that passed this last November, they have that. They are able to really step forward and say, we have a local match. And they can really, they will be better positioned than we are. If we don't have a referendum, we definitely cannot go forward and be competing for a federal dollar for any infrastructure program. So we don't know, again, what the incoming administration will do with regards to program, with infrastructure program, but we want to be ready. And that's why the timing is also very crucial, that while we vote for it right now, it does not necessarily mean it happens the day after or even next year, but it does allow us to position ourselves for potential opportunities that could be coming from the federal level.
So,
Thank you, sir.
thank you for the explanation, Ty. And I understand that the manager would be in a better position to enter into talks with other parties if it was seen that he had the authority from council to do so. So I accept that. I think I just have difficulty with the idea that what we're talking about is a refinement of the plan. That suggests that the plan is 90% complete and that all that is needed are kind of detailed. And we have some very basic questions about how much sales tax it's going to be, whether there's going to be a property tax. We're not in a mode of refining a plan. We're in the mode of developing a plan. And so, and I can just tell you personally, as a matter of the council perspective on this, my yes vote today would be construed by a lot of people as my sort of endorsement of the idea of this tax increase and so on. And you know, I want to work with you. I want to see us develop a plan that will gain acceptance by the public in November. But my feeling is that my responsibility to my constituents requires that I know more before I am seen to be endorsing the entire mobility plan with the rudimentary kind of financing framework that we have. I mean, you alluded to Monday night. We didn't get a large participation by the public at that hearing on Monday. So I have a hard time assigning a lot of significance to the comments that were made. They were all from more or less from insiders or from interested parties. And so I don't feel yet that we have a good sense of the mood of the public about all of this. And I just would have appreciated being a little further along and having a better understanding of our options in terms of financing, and again, not casting a vote that is being called merely an authorization. Don't worry about it. You know, we'll have plenty of time later to change the plan if we have to. And in fact, I just think it will be interpreted as kind of an endorsement in general terms of what the task force came back with and the concept of the sales tax increase. So I will keep an open mind and want to continue to work on this, but I have to tell you, I'm not going to be able to support this action today. Thank you.
Mr. Winston?
I think it gets, you know, me and Mr. Driggs, we find ourselves in the press sometimes arguing about specifics. But what a lot of people don't often understand is that we often agree on some of the bigger topics of discussion in terms of whether they're relevant or not to be discussed. And this is another case of that. I don't share all of Mr. Driggs' concerns, but I completely agree with the premise of his concerns, which is why I started this meeting with that statement. You know, he used a language that is very important. What the perception will be with the actions that we make. So it's going to be so important that we understand the actions that we take. And then whenever we take an action, specifically as it relates to steps in this mobility plan or the Charlotte Moves report, that we go out there and explain every single step. And Ty can't do that. Taiwo can't explain it like he did it. He can't go to Valentine Breakfast Club and Charlotte East and West End partnerships or university city partners and do that. That's why we are here, so the 11 of us can do and have those conversations at the same or similar times. So regardless of where we stand on our individual opinions of the steps that we take or understanding of what our respective constituencies think, we have to go out there and explain this into me. So if we make this recommendation and council adopts this later in January, I think we really need to make sure that we are, for instance, at the strategy session in February, making sure that all 12 of us completely understand what's going on, what this is, what this isn't, agree to it, and then go out into our respective communities and have that conversation, get those questions, and then and keep bringing it back for that cycle, step after step after step. If we don't do that, If we don't do that, if we just focus on our internal work and reaching out to other legislators and elected bodies across the state, we will lose the most important people. And that those are the voters of Charlotte. And we will lose them because they don't understand exactly what's going on, and that will be on us. It is our job as the 12 experts to do that so our staff can focus on actually putting together the plan, as Mr. Driggs said. So I really hope that we add that third step to this recommendation and figure out how to do that effectively.
Thank you. First, I'll say it's a good day when we can get Mr. Winston and Mr. Driggs on the same page. And I think, and in all seriousness, this is a really important discussion. And I'm sort of feeling the same way from a different perspective. But while I understand the need to get the legislative process going, I'm troubled with the phrase funding strategy because I too want to see more detail. I'd like to see a cost-benefit analysis. To Mr. Winston's point, when we go out into the community and talk about this, we have to tell people, here's what this tax increase would mean to you. And we can't just run the numbers on that if you're going to exclude groceries and medication and perhaps lower the transit fare, because we need to be able to say, this is what it's going to mean to you over the course of a year or 5 years, but here are the savings you're going to get, here are the efficiencies that you're going to get. Transportation is way too expensive in our community. We are way over the average by about 6 percentage points. And most people don't really understand that. They don't understand how that impacts the quality of life in our community. We think it's all about housing, and it's not. It's about transportation. So I'd almost rather rephrase this to say that we would like to move forward with a spending and funding strategy so that we can better understand what the money's going to be spent on, what the towns want out of this. If they're fighting it, to Mr. Eggleston's point, they're not sure about this. What is it that they want? What do they want to spend money on? And where do we stand in terms of them being able to do that? I just think that's a really important piece of it. How much is that going to cost? So if you take, let's say it's a $5 billion referendum that we're trying to go after, if it's funded by the sales tax or property tax, to me, the more important question is, what's it going to be spent on? If it's all light rail, nobody's going to see any benefits from that for 10, 15 years. If we're really talking about a bus system, and we're really talking about the towns having better access to a bus system with sidewalks and bus stops, then that's a very different discussion. So I'm not really sure, maybe Kelly can frame that better, but I would like to move forward with giving the city manager the ability to begin the legislative process. It's a function of our weak mayor form of government that we have to do it this way. But I think it's important to do, but I also think that we're asking for more detail with regards to what a funding strategy is. And Kelly, I don't know if you can rephrase that, or Taiwo, if you can rephrase it in a different way so that we can get at the information that we're all asking for.
I can try, and Ty, if you have a better approach, jump in. I think everything you're saying is accurate. Like Ty said, we don't have a financing plan yet. And in my mind, I can't put a financing plan together until I know what the legislation allows us. So if the legislation contemplates 1 penny or a half, that obviously changes the financing plan, and that's an easy one. I can create models around that. But does that also include, I would expect something for the towns, and what does that look like? Is it a percentage of the penny? Is it a portion of the penny? Those are the details that are going to be drafted in the legislation that are going to model the financing plan. So it's the order of the operations. I can spend a lot of time and working with Liz and her team and John and his team putting projects and estimates together, but I still don't think that gets to the place that you want to be at, which is having real answers. It's all still hypothetical until you really know what's in the legislation. So I think that's why we're asking for the ability to move forward with the legislative process to see where the legislators are at. What kind of options do we have for us so that we can put a more refined plan together?
Okay, Mr. Driggs? Thank you, Ms. Flannery.
So my understanding is that a delegation from Charlotte went to Raleigh and has already, in fact, engaged with the leadership and members of the delegation, as was suggested by Mr. Jaoba just now. There was no council authorization to do that. And I don't see why those conversations can't continue without this action that we're being asked to take today. And I will mention that from the feedback I've heard from my contacts in Raleigh, there wasn't a particularly warm response to it. So I don't see why we can't continue to explore over there and get a more definite feel for what the potential is. And the other thing is, from my past experience with financial modeling, Ms. Flannery, I don't see why we couldn't just proceed with modeling on the basis of the assumption that we have a penny and look at that and see what that would look like. We don't need to know from them. I realize there's some work involved, but we can rough this thing out and get a lot further than we are in terms of understanding what the outlook would be without having the answers. So I think there's a question of the cart and the horse here. But if we're going to the legislature and saying, hey, we need a penny, I feel we should be able to say to them, look, we've done the work. This is what that would look like. And this is how this is what that would buy us. And this is how we're confident that that this doesn't impair us in other ways. I get back to the same thing. I just think there's more we could do before having this question put to us to be more confident about exactly what it is we're pitching in the legislature, what conversations we are authorizing the manager to have with other municipalities. Again, I think it's well known that a number of the towns have already expressed negative sentiment, and I've talked to the mayors. The northern towns clearly are upset about the fact that they've been paying a sales tax for transit from which they saw no benefit for 20 years. The word I get from people in Matthews is that they love the idea of having the light rail. They're not excited about the tax. So I just think we've got a lot of work to do to build a consensus, a working consensus where you get people in those other places to cast the same vote that we're being asked today and say, yeah, let's keep working on this. Let's look at this. But otherwise, again, we're in a position by voting today on what is being proposed right now of looking like we're saying, we feel good about this thing. We want the manager to go out and sell this idea to everybody else. And I'm not even sure exactly what he would say if we voted in favor of this now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe
Mr.
I can
Eggleston?
respond.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Jayoba.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I don't know if these are responses as much as clarification. Yes, we did go to Raleigh, but it really was more of an introductory meeting to let the leadership and the General Assembly know what's coming, what we're doing, and that was even prior to the task force finalizing its reports, because understanding how important the General Assembly is, we did not want to be seen as having made a decision prior to approaching the leadership. So it really was a very introductory meeting, and I believe that it gave us good information as to how we can get a proposal better. They did mention a number of things, I said, in terms of working with local and county elected officials, but we also wanted to be very careful with engaging stakeholders without a task force recommendation. With the task force having made its recommendation on December 14th, and that was just about 2 weeks ago, it allows us now to start talking to our county partners and to also be talking about a countywide infrastructure program. Because when you look at the final report of the task force, there are two aspects of the network that are more countywide, and that is the transit piece, and to a degree, the greenway piece. The others, like pedestrian improvements roadway network improvements or even bikeways network improvements are more City of Charlotte centric. Now that the task force has made its recommendation for a 1 cent for mobility countywide, we are now in a position with your support and your direction to the manager to engage the town managers and their staff in respect in all the towns to say, here is, what, we'd like to talk to you about with regards to pooling these projects together. Because what we do not want to do is that somebody else in the future will say, why is Kelly doing this? Why is Dana doing this? Why is the manager making these steps without council authorization or council direction? I think it allows us to be able to engage in some of this and then come back to you in April with a, like you said, a detailed funding analysis that allows you to see what we're getting for what we're asking. One of the things that you're going to be hearing next week at the annual strategy meeting is the Austin story, and how they went through the same thing and answering the same questions within Travis County, I believe, and working with the partners. In the last several months, I believe in July, we brought our colleagues from Broward County who also explained some of these things to us before we got here. So we know there's a lot of questions, but without direction to actually start working on some of these details, we're probably going to be back at this same spot again in the next few weeks. And that's what we want to avoid. We want to make sure that with the direction to the manager, we can actually go beyond the introductory meeting, start working on some language, start talking about some details as to what this even looks like and what's in it for me, answering the what's in it for me question.
Thank you, Mr. Jaiwoba. I still see Mr. Winston and Mr. Eggleston. And then Mr. Driggs, you have another question, or is that your, okay, so in that order. Mr. Winston.
I think Vice Chair was had his hand raised first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Jaiwoba had chimed in, but.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Mr. Winston, and I'll be brief. I understand and respect Mr. Driggs' point that he doesn't want a vote today to be misconstrued as his implied endorsement of the entire idea. My concern would be the inverse of that I don't want not taking a vote or taking a no vote today to be misconstrued as there not being a level of support on the council for continuing to pursue this effort. And I do think there's a lot of questions left to be answered, both for Charlotte and for the other stakeholders involved in our region. But I'll certainly understand and respect Mr. Driggs' vote for the reasons he's outlined. But I do hope that we'll move this forward so that we don't start off with the misperception that this doesn't even have support amongst council, because I think that it does by and large.
Thank you. Mr. Winston.
I want to level set something here because I think it's really important and that we do. I think it is our job to bring skepticism to the process, and that is important. But I think it's going to be very important, again, just to kind of talking about this public conversation that I think council has to lead, that the public understands, and we have to, that City Council and the City of Charlotte and the region believes that we have to figure out different ways to move people and goods immediately and over time as the city and region grow. We are going to invest in transportation. The question that we're going to ask this year is how much and how ambitious and audacious are we going to be in the investments that we make, and this will have a generational impact with whatever decision that we make. But I think we need to make this clear. We need to move forward as a body with confidence that we will invest, and we are looking to make a massive investment in transportation and transit. But we are going to be skeptical and iron out the how that happens as we go, as it goes with any big decisions that organizations like us have to make. we need to go to those other towns within the county and those external towns, municipalities, and counties. I'm thinking specifically in city council districts 2, 3, 4, and 5. We need to go to those neighbors, and especially in those communities that live and work on both sides of the border, to say that there is an interest here. There is an interest here. You guys, the investments that you think that you might not have felt them directly, but how many folks live in Cornelius or live in Mint Hill or live in Union County, but come and work here in Charlotte, that come and play here in Charlotte, that come and invest here in Charlotte. So as we're having these conversations, we need to go out there and tell them, yes, we are trying to do things to bring things directly to your doorstep, but those pedestrian improvements that Mr. Jayoba says, yeah, you actually are going to benefit on those things too. Every time you come to work, every time you go to a concert, every time you come to a restaurant. So we have to, again, this is going to be so important for us at council to walk in confidence and not just present this air of skepticism for the entire plan. We need to be very clear about where our skepticism lies and the work that we're doing to alleviate that natural and correct skepticism that the community is going to have.
Thank you. Mr. Driggs. Here.
I would like to loudly disagree with Mr. Winston as a matter of principle, but I don't. And I think he and I have a similar concern. I mean, I'm going to meet on Friday morning with my group of about 40 people. And if they say to me, why did you agree with this? I just don't feel comfortable explaining it because of the perception I talked about. I also agree with Mr. Eggleston. I think it's unfortunate that we're in a position today of being called upon to say yes or no or whatever, because as I've been explaining for some time, my attitude would be, why don't you guys just keep working on it? That's fine, and I've said repeatedly, we need a plan for transportation, and it needs to be big, no question. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be this plan. And I don't see the alternatives that we've been offered, the contingencies that have been considered, and all of the things that would go into making a commitment of this magnitude. So my preference would be not to have even had this meeting, frankly, and not to be put in a position where, I'm going to say no, for example, today, and that might be interpreted to mean that I'm just a naysayer or that I'm not on board with the idea of an ambitious transportation plan, which is not my intention. But I just don't know enough to be seen to be saying yes to this plan right now. And that's the difficulty. So I hope that somehow we'll come out of this having conveyed the kind of skepticism that Mr. Winston talked about, a kind of, yeah, let's go ahead, but wait and see attitude, with the clear understanding we are not talking about details or refinements. We are talking about very fundamental questions related to the kind of commitment we're going to make, what it means for the public. And I don't think it's good enough for us to kind of talk to the public in terms of a buy now, pay later concept. Don't worry about it. The tax is not going to start becoming effective for 2 years. That, to me, is something that I would have a very hard time saying to people who are worried about facing an additional tax burden in the current environment. So again, I want to be supportive. I think we should proceed with something, and I'm not ready to appear to be endorsing this. Thank you.
So let me see if I can try to reword this into one action, because ideally we would love the whole committee to be able to say, yes, I can live with that or move this forward to the full council. If we had an action that said that we agree to commence the legislative process to facilitate the work of developing a comprehensive stakeholder funding strategy that would be with the understanding that there is a formal funding strategy that will be presented to council in April of 2021. In other words, we understand that we got to have formal conversations with the legislature and with the other towns' elected officials so that we can get that funding strategy in place that includes the priorities and the voices of all of the other stakeholders. Would you be able to live with that, Mr. Driggs? And state that we understand the formal request, the formal funding strategy would be presented to us in April.
Mayor Pro Tem, may I interject real quick? I know you asked Mr. Driggs. I like the direction that you're trying to go. Can we take a few minutes maybe where you can work on that to kind of refine the language for us to kind of stew it properly in our head?
I think we should think about this carefully. So I agree with that. I guess I'm thinking more in terms of authorize the manager to explore options for a comprehensive transportation strategy with other potential stakeholders, and just leave it at that. I don't see why that's not sufficient. He doesn't have to go in there with the presumption that we have bought into this particular plan. And he can take that plan with him if he wants, and he can put it out there as something for them to react to. We don't have to send him out with the kind of go-ahead in terms of trying to realize this particular plan, because we just don't know enough to be able to say that this is the plan we want to offer, frankly, to our would-be partners. So again, my proposal is authorize the manager to explore alternate options for a comprehensive transportation strategy with potential stakeholders.
Can you, are you comfortable with having, making reference to the legislative process? And I guess I should ask Mr. Jaiwoba or Ms. Flannery, what would be missing in this statement that Mr. Driggs proposed that would hamstring you all to be able to accomplish what you want to accomplish?
So Madam Chair, just quickly in response to your question, if we wanted to, my use of the word stakeholders was intended to imply that any party that would be expected to participate in the realization of the plan could be approached in this authority we're giving to the manager. And if you wanted to build in there something along the lines of including other local governments and the legislature, that's fine too. But the key is here that we not go out and try to get people to say yes or no to our plan, but instead we go to them with an open mind to allow them to participate at a more fundamental level in the development of the plan that we're all going to adopt together. I think one of the difficulties that some of these other entities have is that the legislature heard about this officially for the first time, as far as I know, a month or two ago. It's been years in the making, and I've heard that other governments also feel that this is a Charlotte plan and that they're being asked to vote yes or no. So I think we could safely achieve the purpose for today by just saying authorize the manager to explore options with other stakeholders, including other government entities and whatever parties, maybe, by using the word stakeholders, I mean to be cast a wide net, if you will. By all means, go out and talk about alternatives for a transportation strategy, but do not go into those places and put this thing down and say, are you in or not?
Okay, so if I can restate this.
Second.
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Jaiwoba.
Maybe I can jump in here. It's your decision as staff, of course, to give the manager direction to go forward. But you also, I just need to quickly correct that this has not been years in the making. This task force started meeting outside after your annual strategy meeting, January of 2020. And based on that recommendation from that retreat, The task force was formed in February and started meeting in May of last year. While a lot of the plans all the plans, frankly, that they considered, with the exception of the county's MEC playbook and the comprehensive plan, every plan that they considered had been adopted either by this council or by the Metropolitan Transit Commission for many years. So my only concern is whatever language you choose to give to the direction is to make sure that we avoid ambiguity and vagueness, because when you're using the word like explore, it's like we're trying to redo this again. And the reason we're having this conversation is because the task force was put together to make a set of recommendations. Council does not have to accept their recommendations. It just has to review their recommendations and then to go forward on how to make those recommendations better. But what direction you give to the manager is going to begin from what that plan looks like. And we are not going to be going to anyone and say, take it or leave it. It's just going to say, this is the basis. How can we make this better? And that has been our approach to date at the state level, the county level, and even when we've been engaging other stakeholders. So I'm good with that language as long as we can remove ambiguity and vagueness, that we're looking at other plans, to put other plans together, but that everything starts from here and how we can make it better for to be able to, at the end of the day, implement the transformation and mobility network. We all agree that we have issues when it comes to transportation. We may not agree on the mode, but we just want to make sure that we touch all the right people in the process and make sure that we have, light rail may not work for certain people, streetcar may not work for certain people, trails may work for some, roadway improvements will work for some. We just want to make sure that whatever happens, it's an integrated mobility network, but there will still be a decision as to what that network looks like and how it's going to be funded. And that's really the direction you're giving the manager. And I just want to clarify that so that we can take any ambiguity out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jawoba. I think I had Mr. Eggleston first, and then Mr. Newton, did you have your hand up?
Sure.
Okay,
No,
Mr. Eggleston, go ahead.
Thank you. I think we've all made clear that this is not done. We haven't ironed out all the details. There's still things that need to be figured out. And but I do think it's important to signal to the community that this is a priority for this council, or at least the majority of this council. So I think it's important to all of us in different ways. So wherever we've landed on the language, if it could be restated, I'd like to make the motion or second the motion, because I do think that there needs to be some affirmation coming from this committee as this goes to the full council. And again, I think that the fact that we have not ironed out all the details and there are still questions that need to be answered before there's any implication that council is signing off on this entire thing, I think that's been laid out pretty clearly today. So I would hope that there would not be any misrepresentation, for instance, of Mr. Driggs voting in the affirmative today, or frankly, if he votes against this today, I think it's clear that he sees this as important, and he is not against it per se, but just has questions that he needs to be answered. So I hope that we can, as the majority of the committee today, send this forward with some positive energy to the council. So I'm asking for what the motion was that kind of brought together all of the points that have been made.
I would have to ask if we could go back to that slide. I don't have it before me. I mean, I think it's important. I think your point that
that would be the thought.
The point that you made, Mr. Eggleston, is a really good one, is that, this is based on the work that this committee has done and the various policies that we have passed, and we've got to take it to the next step. Whatever we do today is just, we hope we'll move it to the full council for discussion, but not doing that is a huge red flag that this committee, the Transportation and Planning Committee, doesn't have the confidence that we can start a legislative process to hammer out a funding strategy. We're not we don't have a funding strategy that we are trying to sell at the moment, and we can't do that unless we go through the legislative process and include those stakeholders that we referenced. So not doing that at this point would be, I think, more problematic and would send a very different tone to the public. But moving it forward is not a commitment to do anything. It's just to say, let's get all the details that we've been asking for in many, through many different perspectives. So the committee recommendation would be to proceed with strategy for a legislative process. And I'd like to kind of combine it. It says, which will refine a funding strategy as defined by the Charlotte News Task Force and includes potential stakeholders, which could be legislators or other government entities.
So moved.
Do you have a second?
Second. Newton, second.
Okay. Any further discussion?
Mayor, we've talked about this, sorry, Madam Chair, but the issue I have with Mr. Jaoba's last statement was that it highlights exactly the point, because he said we don't want to go in there and give them the impression that we're willing to consider alternatives to this plan. And I think we should do precisely that. I think for us to go to other government entities and say, look, this is the deal, take it or leave it. And that's why I would like to take this plan to those places, but with the understanding that this thing is really open for all kinds of modification, and those may be necessary. If we get told it's a half cent, we're going to have to go back to the drawing board. And I think the fact that we were shown a map of rail lines and stuff and agreed to a 2030 transit plan that looks like this did not constitute the adoption of this. So I've objected in the past to the fact that it's being made to sound as if we had already agreed to this. We agreed in the past that the kind of rail lines and the other transportation infrastructure that was proposed would be a goal to pursue. It's a big step from there to what we're talking about now. And to proceed, once we confront the reality of financial constraints, as if we had answered all those questions in the past and already made up our minds. We did not make up our minds at any time in the past to attempt to do all of this at once and commit to an $8 to $12 billion program of financing and provide that authority to the manager and the staff in advance, as opposed to, say, doing it in stages and considering as the next 10 years unfold in steps, okay, what's our next best move? And what can we now afford to commit to, et cetera? There are alternatives to what we're talking about that could be considered. I think we should have talked about creating an authority, for example. And I think there are others who feel that that would have been a good idea to get everybody on board with participating in an entity that would actually be the issuer of the debt for some of these projects. So there are just a whole bunch of things that we haven't talked about. And I think the idea, having been on council for 7 years, to me, the idea that we were okay with all of this is really kind of not a fair representation of what has been talked about in the past. And the Mobility Task Force took in the plan as recommended by Charlotte and sent back just about exactly the same thing. So again, I think getting that validation was useful, but I don't think it constituted the kind of process that is being suggested. I think they basically looked at and at the end of the day agreed with everything that was being proposed to them. And then almost as an afterthought, they said, yeah, we'll pay for it by a 1 cent sales tax. And if those of you who have been around for a while look back and ask yourself, when was the first time we heard anything about any of this? And I remember one conversation a year or two ago when finally we were told, if you had a sales tax of this much, that would allow you to raise this much money. And we were talking then about a 4 cent property tax increase too, and how that would raise $56 million a year and what that would pay. That was it. And even that didn't come along until what I consider to be very late in the day. So I'm sorry to be kind of negative here, And I'm trying in my own mind to see how we converge a little better around what I'm suggesting and Mr. Eggleston's concern. I don't want to send out a message that that this council is kind of negative about all of this. But I think this council does have a responsibility to send out a message that we will keep our options open. That the scope of things that we may have to consider is a lot wider than just the adoption of this plan. And that's what I'm trying to sort of build into whatever action we take today. And that's why I said explore options. I mean, what happens if they come back and they say you can have a half cent? We don't know. And we need to recognize that's not a detail or a refinement or anything like that. A half a cent is very fundamentally different. And then we get into the process of saying, okay, what can we do with a half a cent? And where do we start? Which is the thing that we need to do first. So I don't know whether there's a further refinement of the language that kind of says, yes, we're in agreement with the idea of a major plan, and now it's time to let other parties who need to participate with us in this plan weigh in and not just say yes or no to something that we conceived. That's my issue.
Mr. Winston?
Yes. So, Mr. Driggs, I just want to remind you that, I hear what you're saying, and I agree that we have to have all those conversations, which is why I think we need to go and explain every step. But we have to remember that we can't have every conversation at the same time at every step. You just brought up things that relate to intergovernmental relations, things that relate to transportation and planning, neighborhood development. So we have to be clear, when we're going to do, you mentioned something like around the transportation authority conversation. Well, that is something that is and can be happening right now. At the year end, for instance, me and Mr. Bakari met with our lobbyists, along with the mayor and the manager to kind of discuss, the forward-looking with the new state legislature and things that we're going to have to handle. The conversation around doing a study, for instance, around a transportation authority is something that is possible, but we have to have that conversation as a council. We will get to that step. These are all steps in a process, and we just have to be cognizant that we have to be confident about this process and kind of walk hand in hand with our constituents through this, and not try to answer all the questions at once, because these are things that are going to happen in a very very complex kind of web of information over time. So again, I hear you, Mr. Driggs, but we have to come to an agreement and confidence that starts with us, that those conversations are important, those are relevant questions, and every step gets us closer to answering that. But we can't have all the conversations at once, answer all the questions that are out there 360 degrees around the entirety of the process, with every kind of specific step.
So I think that if we, and I might have to have Donata repeat are you able to do that? Repeat what we said the motion would be? No. Okay. To try to, it's nuance of wording, right? Because if you look at the second point, it's a fact that the Charlotte Moves Task Force defined a strategy. We're not saying with this action that we adopt this strategy. We are saying that we want to refine the funding strategy with the participation of the stakeholders, which includes legislators and other government entities. And I'm not sure we're going to all get to, nuanced language that we can all agree represents our positions. But I think that if I restate this, I think it moves it forward in a way that says we now need the participation of stakeholders, towns, the legislators, residents in other towns that will refine the funding strategy that was, in fact, defined by the Charlotte Moves Task Force. So that's just our starting point. We can't change that at all. It is what they proposed is what they proposed. So if I restate a motion that says that we would direct the city manager to proceed with a strategy for a legislative process to refine the funding strategy as defined by the Charlotte Moves Task Force with the participation of legislators, government entities, and other stakeholders, other potential stakeholders.
If that's what you said there, Mayor Pro Tem, I believe you already have a motion from me and a second from Mr. Newton.
Okay. Let's vote on that and hopefully just take it to the full council for a decision.
We're still in discussion. I think Mr. Driggs has his hands up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't see that. Mr. Driggs.
I would just say we engage with those others with the goal of adopting a transportation plan. The funding strategy is not a strategy. It says 1 cent sales tax. And as far as I can tell, that's just about all it says. So we're not refining. I keep saying we're at a much more fundamental level. And that's why, in order not to appear to have bought into specifically what the task force recommended, which you're saying yourself we haven't done and are not obliged to do, I would like to find some way to say we would like to engage with the others to talk about strategies for financing and adopting a transportation plan. And that allows for this plan to be offered to all the parties and without objection, without a clearly stated objection from us. But unfortunately, as it now stands, I could not support that motion, and if that's the way it has to be, fine.
Well, what about develop and refine a funding strategy as defined by the Charlotte Moves Task Force?
Mayor Pro Tem, can I make a suggestion?
Sure, please.
And I think Mr. Driggs appreciates this in a way that maybe only he and I do, but there's a difference between the word funding and financing. So perhaps the addition of something reflecting a creation of a financing plan, because I think we've all accepted that one doesn't currently exist. So maybe refine the funding strategy and develop a financing plan, something to that effect might make you more comfortable.
I have a feeling that from the mood that I'm hearing here, and we've been talking about this for a while, we probably will not get to a place that I find acceptable. There appears to be a majority in favor of the motion, so I would suggest that we call the question.
Okay, so we have a motion on the table in a second. All in favor of the motion?
I think you have to do a roll call.
Oh,
Roll
I'm
call.
sorry. Mr. Winston?
Yes.
Mr. Eggleston?
Yes.
Mr. Newton?
Yes.
Mr. Driggs?
No.
And I am a yes. So that passes, and that discussion will go to the full council. Well, that was it. That was a lengthy discussion, but I think it was a really important one. I think we all want to see success in adopting a transit plan that is going to fundamentally change our community and make it a more equitable and fair place for generations to come. But clearly, we've got some really important things that we need to hammer out. And even if we move this on and the full council approves it, I feel strongly that before April, we know where this is going and that we do get answers to our questions, that we do get cost-benefit analysis, that we do get funding and financing options, and we know what they are before they're presented to us in April. So with that, if there's nothing else, then I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Turn off your camera.
Aye.
Thank you, everybody.